Racism isn't always loud, it's often subtle, like a glance, a word, or an action that makes you question your place in the world. For Black people, it's not just about the battles we fight, but the battles we don't see coming. The question isn't why it happens, but how long we will continue to let it. As Maya Angelou once said, we all should know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry, and we must understand that all the threads of the tapestry are equal in value. So let me ask you this, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And before we dive into this powerful story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Behind the Billions. You won't want to miss what comes next. It was a crisp morning in downtown Chicago, the kind of day that carried a promise of change in the air. Parkview Community Bank stood tall among the other buildings, its sleek glass facade reflecting the morning sunlight. The bank was known for its conservative approach to business, its long-standing clientele of affluent individuals, and a reputation that was synonymous with stability. But today, something different was in the air. LaShonda Williams, a successful entrepreneur and CEO of the tech firm Elevation Enterprises, stepped out of her sleek black SUV, the city skyline behind her a testament to her rise in the business world. Her heels clicked against the marble sidewalk as she walked toward the entrance, exuding a quiet confidence that only years of breaking barriers could afford. She had fought her way to the top of a field dominated by men, and even more so, by white men. Every step, every handshake, every deal had been a battle, one she had fought with grace and resilience. Today, however, was supposed to be different. This was the day she would seal a partnership that would elevate her company's profile on a global scale. The deal with Parkview Community Bank wasn't just any business transaction, it was a $4 billion deal that would allow her company to scale its operations, bringing new innovations to the forefront of the tech industry. For LaShonda, this partnership wasn't just about the money, it was a symbol of her perseverance, a testament to the strength it took to reach this point. As LaShonda entered the bank's grand lobby, her presence seemed to command the room. She was used to being the only woman of color in these spaces, but today, her focus was on the opportunity in front of her, not the obstacles that had shaped her path. She walked confidently toward the main desk, where a young woman in a Parkview Community Bank uniform stood. The teller, a woman in her late 20s, looked up from her computer with a detached expression, not meeting LaShonda's gaze. LaShonda's fingers instinctively brushed against the black leather handbag she carried, its strap marked with the initials, LW. It was a small, almost subconscious gesture, a reminder of everything she had fought for and all she had yet to achieve. She offered her ID to the teller with a soft but professional smile, ready to go about the routine check-in procedure before her meeting with Mr. Stevens, the bank's CEO. But what happened next sent a shockwave through her. The teller, without any apparent reason, took the ID and, with a sudden, almost careless motion, threw it onto the marble floor. The sharp sound of plastic slapping against stone seemed to echo in the room, amplified by the silence that followed. LaShonda froze. The action, though seemingly small, cut deeper than any words could. Her hand hovered in the air, poised to retrieve her ID, but the moment stretched on, every second adding weight to the moment. The bank's marble floors, polished to a shine, reflected not only the physical space but the harsh reality of the moment she was facing. The humiliation, the dismissal, the subtle yet very real racism that she had encountered countless times before, but never in such a brazen manner. A lump rose in LaShonda's throat. She wasn't just another businessperson, she was a woman who had clawed her way up, who had defied every stereotype and challenge that was thrown at her. And yet, in that instant, she was reduced to nothing more than a black woman with a fancy ID being thrown on the floor. It was the kind of action that some might brush off, but for LaShonda, it was an all-too-familiar reminder of the walls she had to constantly climb over just to be seen as equal. The room around her seemed to hold its breath. A few people in the lobby shifted awkwardly, pretending not to notice, but LaShonda knew they were watching. She could feel their eyes on her, but not in a way that made her feel seen. No, it was as if they were all waiting for her to react, to fall into the trap of anger or frustration. But she wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Not today. Without a word, she bent down gracefully, her fingers brushing the floor to retrieve her ID. As she straightened up, she looked at the teller, who now seemed somewhat flustered, her face red with embarrassment. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the air between them had shifted irreparably. "I'll be waiting for Mr. Stevens," LaShonda said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil that raged beneath the surface. She turned, walking toward the meeting room with her head held high. The weight of the moment lingered, but LaShonda was determined not to let it define her day. This partnership, this opportunity, was bigger than any slight. It was bigger than her individual pain. Yet, as she walked toward the conference room, she couldn't shake the feeling of the cold marble under her fingers as she picked up her ID. The world around her might have moved on, but LaShonda would never forget the way that moment felt, the humiliation of being treated as less than, of being reduced to a mere object in a world that was supposed to recognize her value. The subtle racism that existed in these spaces wasn't just about what was said, it was about what was done, how she was treated, how she was seen. LaShonda pushed the thoughts aside as best as she could, but the weight of what had just transpired remained. She was determined to succeed, but the question lingered in her mind: would this partnership, this moment of triumph, be enough to silence the whispers of doubt, to prove to the world that a black woman could rise to the top, despite everything? In that moment, LaShonda understood that she was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person of color who had been overlooked, underestimated, and silenced by the systemic forces of racism that continued to plague society. This meeting, this deal, it wasn't just about business. It was a battle. And LaShonda was ready to fight. As LaShonda entered the meeting room, she couldn't shake the sting of what had just happened. The incident at the front desk wasn't something she could simply forget. It was an insult, yes, but it was also a reflection of something much deeper, something more ingrained in the fabric of this country. The small act of throwing her ID onto the floor felt like an echo of the battles she had faced all her life, the subtle, dismissive gestures that were meant to remind her of her place in a world where black women were not meant to succeed. She walked into the sleek, modern conference room, its glass walls offering a clear view of the city below. The sunlight streamed in, highlighting the pristine table and the dozen seats around it. This should have been a moment of triumph, a celebration of everything she had worked for, but now, the weight of that small, seemingly insignificant act threatened to overshadow it all. Mr. Stevens, the CEO of Parkview Community Bank, stood up from his chair as she entered, a warm smile on his face. He extended his hand for a handshake, his handshake firm and confident. "Ms. Williams, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. I've heard great things about you and your company." LaShonda forced a smile. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Stevens," she replied, shaking his hand. Her mind was elsewhere, still processing the exchange with the teller. As she took her seat at the head of the table, she noticed the awkward silence that lingered in the air. It was subtle but palpable, an undercurrent that ran through the room, making her feel like an outsider despite the billions at stake. She glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of the bank's top executives, their faces set in neutral expressions, as if they were holding their breath. They had no idea what it felt like to have your worth questioned at every turn. They had no idea what it felt like to be the only black person in the room, to constantly have to prove your value in a space that wasn't built for you. LaShonda's thoughts drifted back to the moment at the counter, when the teller had tossed her ID onto the floor like it was nothing. It wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But the sting of it was still fresh. She had worked so hard to get to this point. She had overcome so many obstacles, some visible, some not, and she had finally earned her seat at the table. Yet here she was, still being treated as if she didn't belong. The meeting began, but LaShonda found it difficult to focus on the words coming from Mr. Stevens. His voice was steady as he outlined the terms of the partnership, but her mind was racing. She could hear the clinking of glasses, the rustling of papers, but all of it felt like background noise. What did it matter if the deal went through if she was constantly forced to prove herself in a world that didn't believe in her to begin with? She glanced down at the folder in front of her, the carefully prepared documents outlining the details of the partnership. This deal was supposed to be her moment of victory, the culmination of years of hard work and perseverance. But now, it felt like an empty gesture. The truth was, the deal was never just about the business, it was about proving that a black woman could succeed in spaces like this. But as the meeting went on, the nagging feeling in her chest grew louder. Was this deal even enough to silence the whispers of doubt? Would it really make a difference in a world where people like her were always seen as less? As Mr. Stevens continued talking about the financial benefits of the partnership, LaShonda's gaze shifted to the other executives in the room. They were nodding along, agreeing with every point he made, but it all felt so hollow to her. None of them had to deal with the same things she did. None of them had to face the microaggressions, the quiet dismissals, the hidden biases that were so deeply embedded in the system. For them, this partnership was just another business deal. For her, it was a fight to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. The conversation shifted to logistics, terms and conditions, timelines, next steps, but LaShonda barely registered any of it. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the front desk, to the way the teller had looked at her, to the way the bank had treated her as if she was invisible. She could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her, the realization that no matter how many deals she closed, no matter how much money she made, she would always be fighting to prove that she deserved a seat at the table. And then, just as the meeting seemed to be winding down, Mr. Stevens spoke the words that would end it all. "Ms. Williams, we've reviewed everything, and while we appreciate your proposal, we've decided to hold off on the partnership for now. There are some internal issues we need to resolve." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. LaShonda's heart sank, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to spin. She had been so close to proving everyone wrong, but in the end, it was all for nothing. The partnership was dead. The deal she had worked so hard to secure was slipping through her fingers. LaShonda forced herself to stand up, her hand still gripping the edge of the table. She smiled politely, but it felt like the most hollow smile she had ever given. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "Thank you for your time." As she walked out of the conference room, the weight of the rejection settled over her like a thick fog. The battle was lost, but the war was far from over. She had been knocked down, but she wasn't going to stay down. This was just another chapter in the ongoing struggle for recognition, for respect. And LaShonda was determined to keep fighting, no matter how many doors were slammed in her face. She wasn't going to let them win. LaShonda's mind remains preoccupied with the earlier incident at the bank, where the teller threw her ID on the floor. As she attends the meeting with Mr. Stevens, she struggles to focus on the partnership details, feeling the weight of being a black woman in a world that constantly questions her worth. Despite the tension, she pushes forward, but the ultimate rejection of the $4 billion deal serves as a devastating blow, forcing her to confront the harsh reality of being black in corporate America. Everything was falling apart. The polite words from Mr. Stevens replayed in her mind, "We've decided to hold off on the partnership for now. There are some internal issues we need to resolve." She had heard those words before, in various forms, countless times. She had seen them written in rejection emails, spoken in polite boardroom meetings, and masked behind half-hearted compliments and dismissals. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just another setback, it was a blow to everything she had built, to all the sacrifices she had made. The weight of those words pressed down on her chest. LaShonda's mind raced as she forced herself to stand, smoothing down the fabric of her navy blue suit. Her gaze drifted from Mr. Stevens to the other executives seated around the table. Their eyes were on her, some sympathetic, others distant, all trying not to show their discomfort. She knew what they were thinking: how could we turn this into something better? How could we backtrack without ruining everything? But LaShonda wasn't thinking about their discomfort. She wasn't thinking about how this would affect the bank or their future. She was thinking about how, once again, she had been shut out. Once again, despite all her effort, despite all the sleepless nights, despite every ounce of energy poured into her company, she had been reduced to an obstacle. The $4 billion deal was the validation she had needed, the confirmation that she could be a part of the big league, that she was worthy of playing on the same stage as everyone else. And now, it was gone. Just like that. There was no acknowledgement of her accomplishments, no recognition of the barriers she had overcome to get to this point. The partnership was supposed to be the defining moment, the one that would tell the world that a black woman could rise to the top, could lead a company to success despite everything working against her. It was more than just money, it was about proving herself in a space that was not built for her. But now, as she stood in that room, the silence felt suffocating. The bank, with its polished halls and gleaming walls, had just confirmed the reality she had always known: success, for her, would never be measured by the same yardstick it was for others. "I appreciate your time," LaShonda said, her voice steady but hollow. She didn't allow herself to break, not here, not in front of these people. But inside, she was devastated. Her mind flashed to the earlier incident, the moment when the teller had thrown her ID on the floor. That act had been a cruel reminder of her place in this world, of how people like her were still seen as less, still treated as if they were disposable. And now, the culmination of everything she had worked for had been dismissed as easily as her ID. As she walked out of the conference room, LaShonda couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of failure. She had worked for years to reach this point. She had built Elevation Enterprises from the ground up, single-handedly taking on investors, raising capital, and fighting for every inch of progress. But none of that mattered now. The rejection stung in a way that felt more personal than professional. It wasn't just the money, she could find another way to secure that. It was the realization that, no matter how much she achieved, no matter how successful she became, the world would still see her as other. As she walked down the hallway, LaShonda could hear the murmurs behind her. The whispers that she was used to, the ones that came from people who didn't understand what it took to get to where she was, the ones who saw her not as a successful businesswoman but as a black woman in a place where she didn't belong. She stopped in front of the elevator, her reflection in the polished metal doors staring back at her. She looked tired. Her makeup, which had been meticulously applied that morning, now seemed out of place, as if it couldn't mask the exhaustion in her eyes. She took a deep breath, trying to collect herself, but the anger she had been holding back for so long began to bubble to the surface. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that she had to fight twice as hard, that she had to prove herself in ways that others didn't. It wasn't fair that despite all the barriers she had overcome, she was still seen as less than, still dismissed, still disregarded. The elevator doors opened, and LaShonda stepped inside, the weight of the rejection heavy on her shoulders. As the doors slid shut, she glanced at her reflection once more, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She was angry, but she wasn't broken. She couldn't afford to be. The partnership was lost, but LaShonda wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever. She had been knocked down countless times before, and each time, she had gotten back up stronger. This time wouldn't be any different. She wasn't going to let one rejection define her. And as the elevator descended to the lobby, LaShonda made a silent vow to herself: this won't be the end. I'll keep fighting. I'll prove them wrong. No matter how many doors close in my face, I will make my own way. Because I am worth more than their silence.
LaShonda's drive to continue was undeterred, but that day, the moment she walked out of Parkview Community Bank, was one that lingered far longer than she anticipated. Her steps were deliberate, each one resonating with a weight she hadn't fully understood until now. As she left the bank, the hustle and bustle of the city outside seemed to mock her. The world continued on without her, unaware of the internal battle she was facing. She needed to make sense of what had just happened, but as the elevator doors closed behind her and the sound of her heels clicked across the lobby, LaShonda couldn't shake the hollow feeling that gnawed at her. This wasn't just about the deal, it was something far more profound, something that went deeper than just business, something personal, something that she had been carrying with her for years. For a moment, She leaned against the cold exterior of the bank's grand glass building, allowing herself a few seconds of solitude. The city was noisy around her, but inside her, everything felt quiet. The echo of the words, "We've decided to hold off on the partnership for now," played over and over in her mind, like a haunting refrain. The truth was, LaShonda had faced rejection before. She had been dismissed, doubted, and undermined her entire life, whether it was in school, in corporate boardrooms, or now, in the bank she had hoped would be a partner in her dream. But the pain of this rejection wasn't like the others. The magnitude of what was lost, the deal, yes, but also the very validation she had sought, seemed to seep into every fiber of her being. But LaShonda knew better than to let herself fall into despair. It was easy to feel defeated in moments like this. Easy to let the anger take over and allow bitterness to settle in. But she had learned something over the years: staying silent was the most dangerous response. People like her were not meant to stay quiet. The world had a habit of erasing people of color, of silencing their voices when they were uncomfortable with the truth. And LaShonda had spent her entire life making sure her voice was heard. She wasn't going to stop now. As she walked down the streets of Chicago, the noise of the city became less of a background hum and more of a force that mirrored the pulse inside her. There was anger, yes, but also clarity. She knew what she had to do next. She couldn't afford to wait for the world to change. She would change it herself. For days, LaShonda replayed the events over and over in her head. She called her closest advisors and friends, seeking their counsel, but the truth was, no one could fully understand what it felt like to be in her shoes. No one could truly grasp the weight of what it meant to fight for your place in a world that constantly told you that you didn't belong. Jamal, her longtime business advisor and friend, had always been supportive, but even he couldn't understand how deeply this rejection cut. "The deal was big, LaShonda," he said one evening over the phone. "I know how much you've put into this. But there's nothing you can do. Sometimes people aren't ready for what you have to offer." His words were meant to comfort, but they only served to highlight the divide between them. People like Jamal didn't have to fight for respect in the same way. People like him didn't walk into a room where their mere presence was questioned. People like him didn't have to make their worth known through 100 battles that were never seen. She couldn't blame Jamal, he was trying to help. But he didn't get it. Not the way she did. LaShonda found herself retreating into the quiet of her office late that night, surrounded by the blueprints of her future. There were business reports stacked neatly on her desk, proposals, and documents she had been working on for months, yet it all felt so meaningless in the face of this rejection. She had worked so hard, had fought every step of the way, only to be told that her worth wasn't enough. But as the hours passed, LaShonda's resolve began to crystallize. She could either continue letting the system beat her down, or she could rise above it. She could either accept that racism would continue to plague her every step, or she could turn it into a rallying cry, a source of strength. The voices that had attempted to silence her, the subtle ones, the ones that came from the teller at Parkview Community Bank, the ones that came from every closed door and every whispered comment, would not win. They had underestimated her before. They were doing it again now. LaShonda reached for her phone, opening her contacts to the number of her media relations specialist, Naomi. She typed out a quick message. "It's time. Let's go public with this. We're not going to let this go unnoticed." Naomi quickly responded, eager as always to support her vision. "I got it. Let's make sure they hear us." The next steps were clear. LaShonda would take her story public, turning the rejection into an opportunity to challenge the very system that had tried to crush her spirit. She would speak out, not just for herself, but for every person of color who had faced the same obstacles, those whose voices had been silenced by systemic racism, by casual dismissals, by the everyday slights that built up over time. It was a risk. But LaShonda had never been afraid of risks. As the night stretched on, LaShonda sat in the glow of her office lamp, the soft hum of the city filtering through the window. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to feel something other than anger or disappointment. She felt hope. Hope for a future where she didn't have to fight for validation. Hope for the countless black entrepreneurs who would come after her, the ones who would not be subjected to the same injustices. LaShonda knew that this fight was far from over. The road ahead would be long, and it would be filled with more setbacks and disappointments. But she had something more powerful than the words of a bank teller or the decisions of a corporate board. She had her voice. And with that, she would not be silenced. LaShonda didn't waste time. Within hours of deciding to go public with her story, she and Naomi had arranged for an exclusive interview with a popular online news outlet. The story wasn't just about a deal gone wrong, it was about the wider systemic issues that continued to plague corporate America. It was about the racism, both overt and subtle, that people of color faced daily in spaces where they were supposed to be treated equally. As she prepared for the interview, LaShonda found herself confronting feelings she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years: vulnerability, fear, and anger. Speaking out was risky. She knew the backlash could be swift and unforgiving. In the corporate world, especially one that thrived on silence and behind-closed-doors negotiations, speaking out about such matters could lead to isolation, to being labeled as difficult or too emotional. But LaShonda had spent her whole career defying those labels, carving out a space where her voice mattered. This time, it would matter even more. When the camera started rolling, she sat up straight, her posture regal, her eyes focused. She was no longer just the CEO of Elevation Enterprises, she was now a voice for the many who had been silenced for far too long. Her opening words were simple but powerful: "What happened to me at Parkview Community Bank wasn't an isolated incident. It happens every single day, to people who look like me, in boardrooms across the country." Her voice was steady, calm, but beneath it, there was an undeniable current of emotion. LaShonda didn't speak of anger, though. She spoke of justice, of the silent battles fought daily by millions of black entrepreneurs, executives, and employees who were constantly overlooked or dismissed based on their race. The deal wasn't just about money for me. It was about proving that we belong at the table, that our ideas, our innovations, our work, matter just as much as anyone else's. But when I walked into that bank, what I experienced wasn't just poor customer service, it was a clear message that I wasn't worthy of respect. And that message is one that millions of us hear every day, LaShonda continued. The interview was widely shared, its impact immediate. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, social media was flooded with support from people across the globe, both black and non-black, sharing their own stories of racism in the workplace. LaShonda's story resonated with so many who had faced similar challenges but had never had the platform to speak up. Her words became a rallying cry, a call to action for people to demand better, to confront the racial biases that had too long been allowed to fester unchecked. But not everyone reacted positively. Some of Parkview's executives reached out, offering their apologies for the way LaShonda had been treated, and while LaShonda appreciated the gesture, it wasn't enough. Their words couldn't undo the years of exclusion and disrespect she had experienced. Their apologies couldn't fix the institutionalized racism embedded within their system, a system that perpetuated the very treatment she had received. She wasn't seeking an apology, she was seeking change. The media storm that followed was intense. LaShonda was interviewed by journalists from around the country, each asking about her experience and the impact it would have on her business. But LaShonda remained focused on the bigger picture. She wasn't just sharing her story for the sake of it, she was making sure that the conversation was bigger than one person or one company. This was about all the people who had been overlooked, undervalued, and ignored in their careers because of their race. In the weeks that followed, LaShonda used her newfound platform to call for systemic change in corporate America. She teamed up with organizations that focused on racial justice in the workplace, advocating for diversity initiatives, transparent hiring practices, and accountability within companies. She began to push for more black executives to be given real power and decision-making abilities in organizations, recognizing that real change would only come when people of color had the ability to lead, not just follow. But LaShonda's journey wasn't just about reforming the system for others, it was about changing the system for herself, too. She had spent years building her company, Elevation Enterprises, into a force to be reckoned with. And now, she realized that she didn't have to rely on the validation of others. She had built something from the ground up. She had created a legacy. And if she wanted her business to continue thriving, she would have to take control of her own narrative, just as she had taken control of her own story. The partnership with Parkview Community Bank, while important, was only one chapter of her journey. It was a setback, yes, but LaShonda knew it would not be the end. In fact, it had already become the catalyst for something much bigger. The attention her story had garnered had opened doors to new opportunities, new partnerships with organizations and businesses that shared her vision of a more inclusive and equitable business world. LaShonda's story was no longer just her own. It was a collective story of resilience, of fighting for one's place at the table, of turning pain into power. And though the road ahead would continue to be challenging, LaShonda had no doubt that the world was beginning to listen. Her voice had made an impact, and now, it was time to ensure that impact didn't fade into silence. The story of that $4 billion deal was no longer just about numbers, it was about something deeper, something more profound. It was about how far she had come, the challenges she had overcome, and the revolution that had begun in that moment of quiet rejection. Because, in the end, LaShonda Williams knew that the greatest battles were often fought in silence, and the loudest revolutions began with a single voice.